thank you all for joining us today for the first of an incredible series of discussions about where we've been, where we're going as a city, as a country, and as a global community. I do hope everybody today who did fly into our airport did so with confident cabin crew, as remarked upon earlier. For those who don't know me, I am Neil Pakey. I'm the President and CEO of Nieuport Aviation, the owner and operator of the passenger terminal at our downtown Billy Bishop Toronto City Airport. We're one of the few private sector infrastructure investors in the Canadian airport landscape. And alongside our airport partners, including Ports Toronto, the airport owner, and our airlines, we have built a world-class passenger experience that Torontonians tell us in our polling research that they're proud to have as a welcome mat to downtown Toronto. It was just last year that we had the honour of hosting Toronto Global's Business Summit, bringing together business and government leaders for a discussion on how we can safely reopen our businesses and our economy as we emerge from the pandemic. Airports are, at the core, connectors. What gets us and our teams excited each day, and what's really kept me in this sector for almost my entire career, has been this ability to bring people together or bring people back together and linking communities, cities, linking economies, trade, so that people can see new places and revisit old favourite experiences and see new scenes, new cultures, and seize opportunities to come together to create new ones. And now, as we hear in the last session, another really exciting part for us and challenging is how we do so and how we achieve this in a sustainable and responsible way. So it's only fitting that we held the event at our terminal at the airport last year. And now, 1 year on, here we are gathered in person to share ideas and impart our collective wisdom on charting a new economic vision for the future. While the pandemic has led us to shift how we do business, with virtual meetings replacing telephone conference calls, do you remember those? And now we have, of course, hybrid office working solutions. And there's no denying that people still want to travel. It's still the case that the customer will be more taken by the supplier who actually comes to visit them in person rather than trying to make a sale online. And it's still the case that Toronto is home to dozens of world-class conventions and exhibitions that people want to visit. You needn't look at the airport statistics, though, to know this past summer, travel to and from Toronto has come roaring back at a much faster rate than anybody expected, including those in the industry. Indeed, some were caught out by that. At Toronto City Airport, we experienced what one of my colleagues described as a bathtub recovery. In just 1 year, after 18 months of no commercial passenger activities, we've seen passenger levels rise to over 80% of 2019 levels. We've got new carriers, new destinations are being announced once again. And most importantly, our passengers are thrilled to be back in the skies and continue to have an exceptional experience when they do. And bear in mind, for us, it's a 20-minute walk to downtown from our airport. So that is part of the exceptional experience. And which brings me to the topic of this session, the importance of city centre airports. Toronto is fortunate to have a rare global transportation asset, a downtown city airport. It's part of our city's value proposition to the world, but we're not alone in this advantage. City airports form part of airport systems across the globe. From North America, with Washington Dulles, for example, Washington National, not Washington Dulles, get my geography right. Washington National, Houston Hobby Airport, Dallas Love Field, and LaGuardia, who join us today in New York. In Europe, of course, there's London City, Belfast City, Milan Linate. In Latin America, there's Sao Paulo and Rio have city airports. Each have become indispensable to their cities for the connectivity they offer and the trade and travellers they bring. As we think about charting our path to a new economy, as part of an airport system. And critical to that is how we seize the full potential of a downtown airport. Because greater connectivity, as we know, drives economic, cultural connectivity and social growth. Whilst our airport at Billy Bishop Airport is already an important part of the Toronto's economy, an independent economic study released last year by Nieuport Aviation and peer-reviewed by Toronto's own York University found that through continued growth and with US pre-clearance, we have the potential to deliver 4.8 billion of economic impact in just a few years, supporting nearly 34,000 jobs. But in order to unlock those benefits, we need to create the right conditions for success. And that's where our expert panel can help. And I look forward to digging into these topics with leaders from two greater downtown airports, LaGuardia and London City, led by none other than Jan De Silva, the CEO of the Board of Trade. Thank you, Jan. Just quickly, I'd like to hand over to Richard Florida and introducing Richard to the audience. As a leading global expert on city building and urban policy, Richard has written extensively on the role airports can play in driving economic growth. Richard is a university professor at the University of Toronto's School of Cities and Rotman School of Management, co-founder of CityLab, and founder of the Creative Class Group, author of The Rise of the Creative Class, Flight of the Creative Class, Who's Your City, The Great Reset, and the New Urban Crisis. We're delighted to have Richard here to share his latest perspectives on the role of city centre airports as we think about a new economy. Over to you, Richard. Thank you. There you are.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Neil, it's such a pleasure to be with all of you at this Toronto Global Forum. I listened very intently to the last panel and really excited to hear this one. We are going through probably, when it says charting a new economy, we are probably going through the greatest economic and social disruption of modern time, maybe of all time. And just to put a context on what we're living through, and when you think about the Ukraine, Europe, the troubles in England, inflation, problems here, the recovery from the pandemic, I often say the parallels between this time and the 1920s are too striking sometimes. But really, at no other time in human history have we changed the nature of our economy so fundamentally. Maybe when we shifted from agriculture to industry, several centuries ago, but we are changing fundamentally the way we organize our economy from an economy that was based on agriculture, extraction of raw materials, and giant factories in and around places like Toronto that were based on raw materials and physical labor to an economy that is principally powered by knowledge, by innovation and creativity. And that creates enormous kinds of disruption. And those disruptions are ongoing. And that's the challenge we face. But there's a couple points I want to make. And I'm, even with any disruption, I'm extremely optimistic about the trajectory of our economy and especially about the trajectory of Toronto. I mean, you can think of few better places that are positioned to succeed in this economic transition than our own Toronto. You look at what's happening in London, you'll hear about that. You look at what's happening in New York City, you look at what's happening in San Francisco and the Bay Area with crime and urban disorder. And Toronto, despite all the things we know about it, looks pretty good. We're growing steadily. We're now arguably not only the second largest city between the US and Canada, we're probably about the fifth largest metro. The data are a little bit tweaky, but there's New York and LA and Chicago, and then maybe Houston and Dallas, and then Toronto. We're a big economic producer. The metropolitan area generates $350 billion in economic output, which makes us an economy the size of Hong Kong or Singapore. But when you look at the mega region that extends out to Ottawa and over, not quite to Windsor, but over to London, you have economic output of $600 billion, which makes this mega region about the same size as Sweden. It would be the 12th largest economy in the world. And we continue to zoom up the rankings. And Jan knows these better than I do. But when we compiled an omnibus ranking at the University of Toronto, we took all the rankings that are out there from all the consulting firms and all the academic institutions, and Toronto ranked 10th as a global economic center. It's now, depending on who you read, 5th, 6th, 7th as a financial center. We at the University of Toronto now rank 18th in the world as a global research university. PwC ranked as 3rd as a city of opportunity. When you look at those reports on technology talent, we typically come in the top 3 and sometimes top the list. And you know, I've studied economic development and economic transformation for a long time. And I have to be honest with you, the one thing I was skeptical about was all the hubbub about airports. And I'm very good friends with a fellow named John Casarda. John, I've known for 4 decades. He wrote a book called The Aerotropolis. And in that book, he argued that what airports anchor are not just airport functions, transport, travel, connectivity. They are anchors of urban economies. They provide aerotropolis functions. Now, he was principally concerned with the big mega airports like Pearson or John F. Kennedy or London Heathrow. But what's interesting about downtown airports is they bring an aerotropolis function into city centers. And I was skeptical of all of this. So with my research team, we did a study, a big study. We studied in an econometric framework the relative impact of airports on urban and regional economic development. And we really tried to prove that they didn't have quite the role that people like John Casarda said. And we ended up proving John Casarda right and ourselves wrong. That what we found was airports play a fundamental role, a role that even for me, as someone who was in this field for 3 or 4 decades, could not fully understand. That alongside great research universities, alongside great clusters of high-tech industry, and alongside budding clusters of technology talent, airports were one of the 3 core drivers, equally, if not more important than any of those. And what we found was even more important. If airports played that role in older industrial economies by moving goods and cargo, the role they played in the knowledge economy in moving people, knowledge and ideas, was even more fundamental. We had a complete turnaround. We actually came to the conclusion that airports were critical hubs of the knowledge economy, and they are, providing crucial connective fiber between great global cities of the world. And I hate to say this, and I love this country, and both my kids were born here, but I don't think we take this to heart in Canada or Toronto. Not the way the folks out in Singapore do, or in the Emirates do, or all across the world do, even in New York City do, in London do. I think that because we're an aspiring city, because we're a smaller country, because our growth curve is now, we've never fully really understood how crucial airports are. Well, I could talk forever about this, but just a few key statistics. Now, these depend on how you measure airports, and these depend on what you count in a metropolitan area. So we could debate this, but I'm talking about commercial airports. Most global cities have way more than 1 and way more than 2. London, depending on how you count, has 7, and these aren't private air places. New York has 6, Stockholm and Vancouver 5, Milan, Moscow, Melbourne, Sydney 4, and there are quite a group of cities with 3. You can almost count on one hand the number of global cities that have 1, but you see, these downtown airports, these city center airports, are a really unique asset. One of the things I've done, and Jan knows this because we've talked a lot about this, over the course of the pandemic, I've really done a big study of the effect of the pandemic and of pandemics generally on cities and metropolitan areas, not just on cities but on the suburban areas and rural areas, the shift to remote work, to hybrid working. Written a ton on this, given a ton of speeches on this. We continue to do research on this. But when everyone talked about the decline of cities, and the two that were poster children were New York and London, I wrote in April of 2020, New York and London will come back stronger than ever because people want to live there. The challenge in cities isn't people wanting to live in cities. The challenge in cities is because of this transition we're going through from an old industrial economy to a new knowledge economy. These central business districts, these areas with the giant office towers, these areas that used to be populated and that served almost as factories for information workers, these have become troubled, challenged. Back to work is not gone as smoothly as many people hoped. We know that about 20% of working days are done remotely. When you talk about knowledge workers, even more. So the big challenge ahead of all of us as we chart a new economy is how do we remake our city centers? And I have a simple theory that they are transitioning themselves from central business districts where people come and commute just to work. And they have been transitioning. Downtown Toronto has been adding residences, hotels. They become entertainment and cultural centers with sporting events and all sorts of artistic and cultural and music events. You see this in London and New York. They become more desirable as places to live. They're becoming central connectivity districts. That's what we're looking at, and we have to spur this transformation in our community. Well, most places are connective centers for the suburban and rural areas and outlying areas. But when you have one of these city center airports, like London or New York or Stockholm or Houston or Toronto, you have additional connective fiber pumping into your downtown. People can come and take a plane and walk or bike or take a short ride share to go to a meeting, and you become more of a global center, more connected to other places. These city center airports are incredible assets to the cities that have them, including Toronto. I'm thinking and writing more about them. We'll have more to say on this too. But the thing I want to talk to you about and leave you with is, while some cities debate whether they should phase them out or close them, other cities are opening them. I don't know if you read the press last week. My wife's from Detroit. All of my kids' cousins live in Detroit. Detroit right now has 3 airports, and if you count Windsor, it makes a 4th. The FAA gave Detroit $100 million to open its mothballed downtown city airport. That airport was Detroit's original airport, built about the same time as Billy Bishop in the 1920s. It was Detroit's primary airport. It was mothballed in the year 2000. It is being reopened. Why? To create economic development and drive growth and to make Detroit a new and reinvigorated hub of the heartland. You see, downtowns are changing. Downtowns are no longer just the commuting sheds for suburban and rural and exurban office workers. Our downtowns of the future in a knowledge economy are centers for human connection, face-to-face interaction, knowledge sharing. The great downtowns of the world will become even greater. And it's such an interesting thing to hear you talk about. I'm excited to hear you talk about New York and London and Toronto in the same breath. But when you combine a downtown not only with local transit and transport, but with the kind of air transport that you connect you to other international hubs, and in some cases, and hopefully in more cases, to global hubs, you have an incredible asset moving forward as a global city and a global region. Anyway, enough from me. I'm excited to hear the panel. And this is a unique pleasure for me, Jan, because it's usually the other way around. I have the great pleasure and honor to introduce someone who is really so critical, and I say this from the bottom of my heart, who has played such a critical role in the ongoing transition of our city and region. My great friend Jan De Silva, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Toronto Region Board of Trade, who will help facilitate this exciting panel discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to share a stage with Richard because he's the most passionate person for our city, and he's always bringing tremendous insights into what's making the strongest, most globally competitive cities. Richard, let me just simply say two key points I absolutely agree with. Our city airports absolutely are critical economic enablers, and our government and the public absolutely don't get that. So that's why this discussion today is so important, is to shed light on that. These airports connect our businesses to growth markets. They connect international investors easily to our business centers, and they bring major event participants into our markets. They drive economic growth at home. They operate as major employment zones and transportation hubs throughout our economy. Neil shared some great stats on how quickly demand has recovered post-pandemic. As of September, Canadian airports are running at 85% of pre-pandemic volumes, and that number is on the fast path, I guess, whatever you would call it in airport lingo. Toronto was the fastest growing metro in the US and Canada prior to the pandemic, and we're poised for continuing dramatic growth over the next 10 to 15 years. Our population is expected to grow to 10 million from 6.7 million today. And with that, the demand for air travel and access to the core is going to increase. By the mid-2040s, Southern Ontario, our region, is forecast to move more than 110 million passengers and millions of tons of cargo annually. And here's the problem. No single airport in our region can support that demand alone. All of our airports need to be functioning at full capacity, and their contribution to our economy and our growth, as Richard indicated, can simply not be underestimated. Canada's airports prior to COVID directly contributed $59 billion to collective GDP. They employed 272,000 people and generated more than $7 billion in needed tax revenues. Enabling our growth plan for our region requires a plan and support from Ottawa, not only for Toronto Pearson, Canada's largest and most internationally connected airport, but through the region. Our own city centre airport, Billy Bishop, is such an incredible competitive advantage for us. It's the 5th busiest airport in Canada for US travel. By 2025, we expect it to serve just under 5 million passengers a year and create just under $5 billion of net economic output. Nearby Hamilton International Airport is a bustling cargo hub and handled more than 766,000 tons of cargo last year. That's inputs to manufacturing, that's goods to our consumers and our markets. Local airports play a crucial role in cities around the world, and few people know that as well as our guests do today. And my goal by the end of this is to make sure you understand it as well as they do. It's my privilege to welcome our panelists, Stuart Steeves, Chief Operating Officer, Vantage Airport Group. You'd see his bio in the pack. Neil touched on that as well. But what you might know is that while Stuart is based in New York, he knows us extremely well. He's a fellow Ivy grad. And he also is vice chair of the board of Hamilton International Airport, in addition to the work he does looking at airports around the world in their portfolio. Bernard Laval, president of BL Aviation Consulting. I have to say, Bernard, thank you for the LinkedIn shout out about the Toronto Global Forum and about today's panel. And I quote, this was on his LinkedIn feed, 30 years working at London City gives me a little insight into how city airports help drive economic and social development within its host city. Toronto has its own amazing airport in Billy Bishop, so Toronto is a great city to host this discussion. I agree. And my good friend Neil Pakey, CEO of Nieuport Aviation. As we know, he's the owner and operator of our very favorite city airport, Billy Bishop, Toronto City Airport. So Stuart, let's start with you. Your company, Vantage Airport Group, has developed and managed over 30 airports of various sizes around the world. City airports like Midway in Chicago, and you led the rebuild of LaGuardia in New York. Describe the unique role that city airports play in both the transportation picture, but also the economic picture of cities.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jen. And it's great to be back in Toronto. I grew up here, but my career hasn't often brought me to Toronto, so it's wonderful to be here. City center airports we have many in our portfolio, several. They all have somewhat different characteristics, but I think as a general rule, though, they have a unique characteristic, and they form an important part of the overall transportation and aviation network in a city. And as you mentioned, like here in Toronto, Pearson, Hamilton, Billy Bishop. And I think uniquely, city center airports aren't necessarily hub airports. So the travelers that are using them are destined to Toronto to work, to visit, to entertain for tourism reasons. And so it makes it a very unique injection of people who are destined to the city and who are going to be direct contributors to that economy. And so it's just an important part of that overall transportation fabric, and really a complementary and an important visitor. When you get large hub airports in the more suburban areas, a significant percentage of those travelers might be connecting through. They're not really destined to that city, where the city center airports often are drawing people right in for all the reasons that Richard was describing before. And I think that just spills over into the economic effect within the city itself. I mean, airports, I've spent a career building and operating and managing airports, not studying them as Richard has. But one just needs to look at maps of cities. You look at the map of Toronto and you see where the economic development is and where the growth is, and it leans west. That's because Pearson is there. The same thing happens in the urban centers around city center airports. You just can't see it as much physically when you look at a map, but it's there. It drives that economic growth. It drives that activity, and it's good for the region. It's good for the region because the region needs multiple service points to address growth and to manage things such as congestion, so people can be served close to where they want to work and where they want to live and where they want to play.
It's terrific. Bernard and Neil, anything to add?
I just put a couple of figures actually onto that from the London experience about city airports actually driving people into the city itself. So Heathrow is the main hub airport. London City is on the other side of London, on the east, but they're actually complementary. But if you actually look at the percentage of business travellers, so Heathrow has just over 30% of all travellers are travelling on business. And as we said before, a lot of those also be connecting through to other destinations. For London City, that's over 50% of passengers are coming into London, with only about 5% connecting. So that is driving traffic through, and this is what city airports do, is actually drive a lot of business traffic, which has a greater multiplier effect for a city's economy. So certainly for the London experience, having the city airport and that higher percentage of people travelling on business has been a great bonus.
Yeah, I'll just add from the perspective of Nieuport, that whole thing on the airport system and the complementary nature of it is so striking in Toronto that you've got the likes of Hamilton, which is great for doing really well on cargo. It's also well placed for the low cost market. These are two markets that would just not be on our radar. And Pearson, of course, is the international hub, and that's not us either. So it's very striking how you actually find your niche within an airport system, and in a complementary way. And this Pearson, with the runway capacity at Pearson, looking to have the larger aircraft going in there. Well, that's not a market for us either. We don't want the larger aircraft. And again, it helps then that we act as a complementary nature to that relationship with Pearson.
Yeah, and again, to the point that we can't have one airport servicing all the needs that we have in our region. And Stuart, I like how you reflected it. It really is a point-to-point play that you have with these city airports. Bernard, here's the thing. City airports are a blessing and a curse, according to the neighbors who live around the airport. So being so close to where people live, how do you manage the relationship with the nearby community to make sure that the importance of the airport is understood, that the airport can continue to fill its important economic role, and that the community comes along?
That's a very, very good question. So when London City was first opened or proposed and they were constructing it, it had support of national government, but it didn't have support of local government. So London is split into different regions called boroughs, which each has its own political government running those in particular boroughs. And the London Borough of Newham, where London City is located on the eastern side, was very much against an airport being built in its area. But we recognised this very, very early on. And one of the things we did very early on, back in the in fact, before the airport was even opened in 1987, is we actually sat down with local government to actually understand what their concerns were, but also to try and understand what their aspirations for the region were. And we found that we could actually agree on many areas more than we disagreed. It was about economic growth. It was about education. It was also about employment. And we said these are areas that are focus areas for us as well, and we want to be part of that community. And so we started education programs. In the particular area where London City is located, the English, speaking of English, was actually language number 3. Wasn't the first native language. So we put in education programs to get people to be able to have their English up to levels where they could apply for jobs in other local companies and also at the airport as well. And one of the key schemes I always remember is a scheme we ran with the local government to get the long-term unemployed back into work. And there was one particular candidate, a gentleman by the name of Anthony, who was long-term unemployed and within 2 years was actually running this scheme for us. And I can't think of a better success story than that. So it's about trying to be seen as part of your community, about putting investment into that community, but real investment that people can see the benefits of. And with education programs, getting people back into employment and working hand in hand with local government, that was key for us getting the local people and indeed the local government back on side with us.
Yep. Stuart, Neil, any thoughts on what you've done with community engagement?
Well, for us, I think maybe our starting points is with our partners, Ports Toronto. So Ports Toronto owning the overall airport and we owning the terminal. And it occurred to me that we were actually both going and doing different things, complementary by chance, but we're doing different things to do with the community and the community support. And the greater alignment between us and Ports Toronto is proving to be a much stronger proposition. And for us, the community, it started probably with our free bus services every 15 minutes, the free shuttle bus into town. But then looking at the activity of the waterfront community in particular for us, again, supporting lots of projects, supporting the public arts project as well, the city's initiative of Year of Public Art last year. We've got Indigenous Art Gallery there, the Moccasin Identifier project at the airport, and that's been really rewarding. And we've got so much more, of course, we can be doing going forward. We look at events at the airport. The airport, of course, closes at 11 p.m. For the night, but maybe there's some quiet things we can do outside of aviation. The Nuit Blanche, for example, I think. So we're always looking for ideas and ways of working with the communities.
Stuart?
Yeah, and I'd say community engagement is absolutely critical. And I think it's particularly acute at city airports or urban airports, because often those airports are surrounded by disadvantaged communities that have been economically disadvantaged in some way. And so while all airports take it on to some degree, I think it's particularly important at city center airports to embrace the local community through education, training, jobs, contract opportunities. And we've adopted many of these programs, for example, in LaGuardia Airport, and it's looking at innovative procurement methods to break down traditional procurement methods, so to lower the barriers to entry to local participants in the local communities. Creating jobs, we put in place a jobs program where we hired youth who were out of school, unemployed, so at risk, and brought them into regular and full-time employment. Educational partnerships with local high schools and technical colleges and giving them internships. Artists, like for concessions in terms of restaurants, food and beverage and shops and things of that nature. So just looking at all kinds of opportunities to embrace the community so that the local community immediately surrounding the airport understands directly the economic advantage and the connectivity of that airport. So it's not just a kind of contribution to the kind of economic growth story. It's a very local and personal story to the community that surrounds it. And that community can be extremely important as well, because normally when you're close into the city, that's a community you rely upon for the jobs, because the transit links and such are there and make it extremely convenient. And it's an opportunity, in fact, because larger connecting not rural, but remote airports can be very difficult to get to for workers and employees, where the inner city airports can be much more convenient. So there's a real opportunity there.
Yeah. Okay, you're going to get me started. I was going to say Pearson's a case in point where it's the second largest employment zone, 300,000 workers, and the most poorly served with public transit because it sits on the corner of 4 cities, provincial and federal land, so there's no transit plan to connect those workers, a huge problem. Whereas, as you pointed out, with our city airports, that's not the case. It's much easier access. Neil, back to you. I don't know how many people have gotten a chance to know Neil as well as I have since he's been in town. He's been a very dynamic leader of Billy Bishop. This is an airport guy through and through. He brings more than 20 years of international experience to this role, having worked in Shannon and Liverpool airports. And you started on the tarmac. Your very first job was as a ramp officer, I understand. And so that meant you had the hearing things, like the...
Pardon?
Yeah, the protectors and everything else on. So reflecting on this, I mean, what drew you to downtown airports? What is the real potential of these airports?
Yes, thank you. I think the thing I've always loved about airports is things we've been talking about. You know, working with communities is a massive part of it. At Liverpool, I was lucky enough to rename the airport John Lennon, and it was so good. But for Liverpool, what was important was just getting that identification with what the city was about, and the city was all about creativity and music and future, and it was just great to be part of that. So it's about sort of finding your identity and the sense of place. It's something that Stuart's company Vantage are very strong on, the whole sense of place. I mean, one of the airports you've been inspired by was Vancouver, and you know, and I think that's taught me, you know, about some more education about the Indigenous communities here and how are we going to build into creation of a real sense of place and sense of identity. So that community side, you mix that with I mean, one of the first jobs I had was at Manchester Airport, and one of the first successes, if you like, was linking Singapore Airlines to Manchester Airport, and the thrill of seeing the first people coming off the Singapore flight just stayed with me. I thought, I've got to have more of this, and like, you just sort of act as a connector. That was a huge part of it. And now it's a huge thing now, of course, about sustainability, and I think that's you've got to come up with solutions and ways of how to change and transform our industry into the next decade. So those things, and here it's no different. I think the communities here, and downtown in particular, with the you know, just getting to terms of the number of people who walk to the airport.
Yeah.
You know, it's a different thing, and it's very exciting.
But let's continue on that, because while our city airports are located close to our cities, they don't always have the best transit connectivity. So yes, I think we're very proud, Billy Bishop, the percentage of people that walk or ride a bike to get to the airport, which is great. But what has your experience been in physically connecting airports to cities? What is needed to really achieve the full impact that these airports can be having? Bernard, let's start with you.
When London City first opened, it didn't have any public transport, didn't actually have any road infrastructure. I famously turned up for my interview and turned left instead of right and walked through a building site and was covered in dust when I turned up, but they still employed me. 2005 was a very, very important year for London City. It was when the Docklands Railway, which is part of the London transport system, actually connected directly from the Bank of England in the heart of London, directly into the terminal at London City. It was transformational. Just appearing on the London Underground map for the first time and actually being able to point, that's where London City Airport is, made a huge difference in people's perception of how you could get to the airport. So it was a huge win for London City. But it wasn't just a win for London City, it was actually a win also for the local community, because there weren't just 2 stations, one at Bank and one at London City. There were a number of other stations in between, which suddenly gave the local community, who didn't have a direct link into London, for the first time, public transport that was fast, efficient, and could get them into London and out of London as well. That itself then brought in additional investment. It brought in additional housing into the area. And without that public transport infrastructure, the airport would never have been able to grow to over 5 million passengers as it had been just before the pandemic hit in 2019. So absolutely public transport or transport infrastructure of all kinds is incredibly important for city centre airports.
Stuart?
I completely agree. I think it's an ongoing challenge, I think, particularly in North America. I mean, Europe does it so well. Airports aren't just airports. They're really transportation nodes or hubs. And then from that, there's all kinds of economic development and growth that can occur. And you see that so often in Europe, where airports are also transit hubs, regional rail hubs, all other things combined. In North America, we declare success when there's a rail connection from the airport to the downtown core, but that seems to be the end of it. And even that can be a challenge. And I think at city center airports, they should be transit connected. They're just well set up for that. But then there's transit challenges in terms of building those connections in an urban and built up environment. We see that in New York. There's been a long running discussion about connecting a train to LaGuardia Airport. Still LaGuardia, it's 8 miles from Midtown Manhattan, but the only way to get there is, as I say, on something with rubber tires. We have to try and move past that, and that's very much the vision of the Port Authority and others in New York to make that happen. So transit connectivity is absolutely key to leverage an airport and just any airport, but particularly challenged sometimes in city center situations just because of the built-up environment.
Mm-hmm. Neil, we've got this problem in spades.
Well, yeah, and echoing a little bit of both Bernard and Stuart, it's funny, one of the first things I was looking at when I came 4 years ago was the maps and the TTC map, and like, where's the airport on the TTC map? After all, we have the bus service that, okay, it's the Fairmont, but that's just across the road from Union Station, so for all intents and purposes, it's a connector into the transport network of Union Station, so. And it still hasn't appeared. I've had a chat with the CEO of TTC, so hopefully that something will happen. But then when it comes to the planning as well, you kind of think, Ontario line, that's funny. There's no mention of the airport on the map. And I think, okay, maybe that's for the next phase B or whatever. But you would think that given the economic impact that the airport has, that it would be desirable from the planning perspective to actually look at how do we do this last mile connection into the airport to get the best out of it for the city.
Yeah, Ontario Line's a brand new, for those who aren't familiar, a big extension to our subway network in Toronto. Let me also just share a personal story. Our offices, the Board of Trade, have been right in the downtown core for the last 45 years. We've just moved down to our Waterfront Innovation District, gorgeous new building. Unobstructed view of aircraft landing at Billy Bishop all day long, and you look out our office tower at all the other office towers that are in this new neighborhood, as well as all the condos that are in our new neighborhood, and think, how the heck are we going to get over there? And the thing that's between us and the airport, it's not the congested road that's sitting there because we haven't got transit built yet in this part of the waterfront, it's the lake. So we're really seized with, you got Port Authority owning kind of the airport. How do we get a hydrofoil at a Jack Layton Pier over to Billy Bishop and then on to Mimico Go as a way of moving people around? So we want to think about all of that carefully because we think we can use the lake faster than it would take to get traditional transit built. And Neil's all over that, so we're going to be working on that together.
Thank you.
Stuart, let's turn over to, the previous panel spoke about disruptions, spoke about climate transition. This is a big issue for airports. And I know a lot of our goods movement companies, UPS has, they have a plan for climate transition. Their biggest challenge, however, is aviation fuel. That's going to take a long time to get there. But there are other things that can be started on. So can you talk to us about the work that's going on with climate transition in your portfolio?
It's absolutely key. Aviation is an industry that needs to be environmentally responsible for the reasons you just mentioned. The airlines are looking at sustainable aviation fuel and other alternatives. But airports, our scope 1 emissions, carbon emissions, are airlines' scope 2 emissions. So when they do their math, and we're one of their suppliers. So we're an absolutely critical component of that initiative for our own reasons, but also for our airline partners' reasons. And I would also say that airports generally, we're public facilities, the public uses us. And we need to move towards a greener future. And airports as public facilities, we have, I would almost suggest, an obligation to engage and inspire the traveling public on what's possible. So we need to take a leadership role. And I think this is particularly important at urban airports as well because of the importance of our neighboring communities. You know, not just carbon, but also, you know, noise and traffic and all these other things that are also contributors to environmental impacts or just community impacts. So I know, you know, we as an organization have taken a lead in terms of, you know, new LEED gold standards for our buildings. We're moving towards a net zero future within all of our airports and putting all of our airports on a plan to achieve that, working with our partners on all manners. You know, airports are, they're kind of big ecosystems. In fact, it's hard, sometimes we don't say we manage the airport, we try and describe ourselves as like an integrator. We integrate all these different participants, you know, the public, the community, airlines, suppliers. It's a very complicated ecosystem, but it's absolutely a key focus to move it towards a carbon neutral future for basically the fortunes of the industry itself, but also because of our community neighbors and protecting our role within the community.
No, absolutely. Neil, comments on what's happening. I know you've got big plans for greener and cleaner at the airport.
Yeah. In one sense, we could easily kind of almost rest in our laurels, but we're not going to. And the reason I say rest in our laurels is because statistically, a downtown airport has a lot less of a transit time and also a higher degree of public transport. So actually, you know, if you're going to a regional airport like Hamilton, it's probably about average journey time of 60 minutes or something, whereas at our airport it's less than 30. And also we're 40% of public transport, so our CO2 emissions per arriving or departing passenger is actually probably the lowest in Canada. So that's a nice starting point, but you can't rest on your laurels. You have to look at things, and I think credit to the Ports Toronto. They've got the electrified ferries, and it was a tremendous announcement and great flagship. Great for us as well. I mean, it motivated us to get on and announce that we're going to electrify all the buses. And I think, you know, if we can have all the public transport electrified into the airport, yeah, it's a good start. And you know, at the same time, we're doing things like the LED lighting and other things within the terminal to make an impact. And I think the other thing, though, is that what about the aircraft themselves? And I saw this week that American Airlines have invested in universal hydrogen as a business. And I'm thinking, okay, you can see this development of electric aircraft, perhaps, or hydrogen-fueled aircraft, alternative fuels. And I think that's something that the airports can also get supportive of, even though it's more of an airline thing, and who knows how quickly it might develop, and hopefully the quicker the better.
No. Stuart, anything to add? Bernard, rather, sorry.
Okay. You threw me there. Within Europe, the trade body that represents European airports, ACI Europe, has set a target for European airports to have zero emissions by 2050. London City has taken that one step further and has announced that it will be have zero emissions by 2030, so 20 years faster than the ACI target for European airports. One of the big elements of that, which Neil has mentioned, and I mentioned earlier about the transport to the airport. So 73% of passengers who arrive or leave London City use some form of public transport. The actual car park at London City hasn't changed since I started in 1988 at the airport. It's still pretty much the same size. And the reason for that is to encourage people to use public transport and not to drive their cars to the airport. So it is pretty expensive to park at London City if you don't use public transport. But other things that the airport has been looking at, Neil mentioned about electric buses. Again, that's something that London City is looking at the moment, to get all airside vehicles to be electric rather than traditional diesel or petrol driven. But they're also looking at reducing the and getting to the point of eliminating gas usage within buildings, re-engineering all their waste management system to substantially increase recycling. So there's a number of projects that are going on. And if airports want to grow around the world, whether city airports or hub airports, they need to grow sustainably. and that's what London City is focusing on at the moment.
And I might just add, if I can, by having secondary or smaller or urban airports, it offers an opportunity both to serve the traveling public closer to where they might be originating from, so less travel time, less carbon emission getting to the airport, and as well, from an aviation movement perspective, there's less engine on time for the aircraft as well. It's more direct in, faster to the gate, engines off, when you can kind of allocate and distribute the traffic. Large hub airports often have much longer flying times because of how the aircraft need to circle and approach, much longer taxi time on the ground. And these are all factors that work to the benefit of some of the smaller and urban airports or city center airports as well.
Yeah. So a key factor that may not be front and center in public and government awareness.
Not often thought about, but something that the airlines do talk about.
A lot. Yeah. How far away are we from passengers, the market, wanting apps that actually track the GHG impact of their travel?
That's a good question.
Everyone's looking at each other.
You're the passenger, John. You tell us.
What do you think? Is that something on the horizon to be able to demonstrate to a passenger when they're booking a flight through Billy Bishop? You know, here, what are the options you have to reduce the impact of your travel? We already do all of this, but if you walk or take an electrified shuttle rather than car sharing or ride sharing, I'm not picking on the ride sharing industry. I'm just saying, is that where we're headed in the short term?
I think we're definitely headed there. I think society as a whole is becoming more aware of this, particularly the younger generations, and it's factoring into people's decision making across all of their consumer behaviors.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that more and more. And so we should absolutely expect it's going to be a component of air travel as well.
Yeah, I think, data, digitalization, technology is the future for airports as it is for everybody, really. And I was in a meeting with the US Homeland Security this last week, and they were getting excited because they could see our airport becoming a bit of a pilot for some of their new technologies, et cetera, as well. So, that's a great idea, and I think we're heading in that way.
Okay, our last question for each of you. Where do you see the aviation sector 20 years from now? What's the same, what's different, and what does that mean for city airports? Bernard, let's start with you.
I think it's all actually, it's kind of one of the current themes for today. It's all about sustainability and growth. Airports want to grow. The aviation sector is one of the most dynamic sectors. I've worked in aviation all my life, but it's one of the most dynamic sectors that I've come across. So one of the really interesting things that's happening in the UK at the moment, and London City is part of this, as is Heathrow, as is Cranfield University and so on, is a project called Project Napkin, which is about how to develop not just the next generation of fuel, but the next generation of aircraft. And it's taking the combined knowledge of these groups. And the idea is to, around 2030, to have zero emission flights starting to smaller regional routes where you can use the smaller aircraft and run them profitably, with the aim of, in 20 years' time, of moving to larger aircraft, 100-seat type aircraft, which are typical of kind of city airports and smaller regional airports, where again, you're looking at zero emission flights, whether that's with sustainable aviation fuel, whether that's electric, whether that's hydrogen or something else which we haven't quite discovered as yet. And I would see these becoming more mainstream going forward, so that when you're hopping over to, say, to Frankfurt in here or to New York from Toronto, that you start seeing newer aircraft. And I've noted, actually, interestingly, I think Air Canada has bought 20 or put in a bid for 20 electric aircraft when they become available. So those type of aircraft will become more mainstream as we go forward. And I think city airports in particular will kind of lead that development.
Stuart?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, first of all, air travel, I believe, will continue to grow. If we saw anything through COVID, is that the desire to travel is extremely robust. And I know the stats in Canada are still 80-85% of 2019. I can tell you domestically in the US, we're at 110% of 2019. So there's been an absolute resurgence in the desire to travel. And then we look at how connected the world has become, in the stat before, but more than 50% of Torontonians were born somewhere else. Those stats all support global connectivity and travel. So that's not going away. But what we're going to see is more sustainable forms of travel in the aviation. And we're going to see, there's already electric aircraft flying. Like Harbour Air is flying an electric Beaver on the West Coast. It's not, I don't think, in commercial service yet. But we're going to see over the next 10, 20 years, we're going to see electric aircraft as batteries become more efficient, lighter weight. That's what we're going to see. We're just going to see sustainable aviation fuel, electric aircraft, but we're going to continue to see more and more air travel.
Neil?
Yeah, I of course agree with Stuart. The interesting thing from a Toronto perspective is we kind of look at the city's forecast, we look at your forecasts about what's going to happen to Toronto over the next 20 years, and we have to keep pace. I mean, you know, we've got a responsibility to help that be achieved. Without us, you wouldn't be able to get there. So there's that side, but you just need to look at 20 years ago from now and take your question, turn it historically, and you can see how far the industry's come in that 20-year period, and especially aircraft technologies, etc., and how improved they are from a noise perspective, etc., from where they were then. And that's going to continue, but I think at a faster rate, to Stuart's point, and there's a lot of companies out there getting involved in alternative fuels and so forth, and I think that's going to be a big thing. And then from the passenger experience, finally, I think that's also going to change. You know, you probably get through all the processes in 20 years' time just by your eyes, and being recognised by your eyes through the process. So there's lots of technology that's going to be great.
It's been a great discussion. Richard, I hope we've proven your case that airports are really part of the core critical enablers for economies. And, you know, I spoke before about our city airports are misunderstood. Lots of good insights to take away from our discussion with our panelists today. I mean, just thinking about the point-to-point connectivity that these city airports create for us. The fact that it's now enabling our businesses to access close regional markets, that we've got investors able to come in and access our market. We've got major events participants easily able to get in and out of our cities, critical for the economy. The community implications, again, is something we don't often reflect on, some amazing work that's going on. But I think perhaps the biggest takeaway is the potential of these airports for climate transition innovation. We can start there, we can pilot there, and develop solutions that ultimately will help our international hub airports over time. So I want to thank all three of you for joining us. Great to have you in town. Keep LinkedIn posting about us, Bernard. We love, love, love to have ourselves on the news. Stuart, great to have you back in town. We were talking before about a LaGuardia Billy Bishop connection. We should get that going at the break. And Neil, terrific. Keep doing what you're doing. A warm round of applause for our panelists, please.